Hey, I'm Aisha. You can now watch UCF TV 24 hours a day on Bright House Digital Channel 1.
While the Everglades is not, strictly speaking, within the boundaries of the Metropolitan Center's regional purview, we do have a toehold in the discussion. How many of you have been driving down Sand Lake Road and seen the sign that says, "Crossing Shingle Creek, the headwaters of the Everglades"? It's fun to have it all begin in South Orange County. Our last forum in the spring, in fact, outlined efforts that will create an Everglades Trail from Orlando to Lake Okeechobee and beyond. And I've had the great pleasure of flying in a small plane with Dale Allen from the Trust for Public Lands and Harris Rosen to see how that trail might actually work. Very, very small plane down that path from Shingle Creek, across the Osceola Lakes, down the Kissimmee River, and on to Lake Okeechobee. Now, that was just before June, and one thing that made an enormous impression on me that day was the vast expanse, as far as the eye could possibly see, even from an airplane, of sugar fields around Lake Okeechobee. So I was just as intrigued as all of you by the announcement in June of a $1.7 billion buyout of 187,000 acres owned by U.S. Sugar in a plan designed to restore the flow from the lake to the Everglades. The plan has been called everything from a gift to the people of Florida and a dream coming to reality to a financial boon for U.S. Sugar's rival, Superpower Florida Crystals, owned by the powerful South Florida family, the Fanuels. So, what's the truth here? We are hoping to find out this morning with our keynote speaker and a trio of Everglades experts. Our keynote speaker today, Michael Grunwald, is an award-winning journalist, currently a senior correspondent for Time magazine. His career with the nation's most prestigious news organizations began right after his graduation from Harvard. He joined the Boston Globe, first as a local reporter and then moving up to national issues before leaving to join the Washington Post, where he covered Congress and the Justice Department. It was during those years, during a year-long investigative reporting assignment on the Corps of Engineers, that his interest in the Everglades began. And that piece won the George Polk Award for National Reporting, the Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Reporting, and the Scripps Howard Award for Environmental Reporting. Returning to the swamp in 2002 for a series on the Everglades Restoration Project, another award-winning effort, Mike then moved to Miami, where he researched and wrote The Swamp, and I'm so glad to see so many of you carrying your copies this morning. For those who haven't picked it up yet, we have it available, and Mike has promised that he will sign some. And it received absolutely rave reviews from every major publication in the country. Mike himself will tell you that the most important aspect of his move to Miami and to Time magazine is that he met and married Florida attorney Christina Dominguez, which is, again, why we in Orlando get to claim a local connection. Local civic activists Carmen Dominguez and Maylin Arlen are his in-laws. So we all figured we got some of the reflected glory when The Swamp was named Editor's Choice by the New York Times Book Review. A fellow environmental writer offered the supreme accolade when he said, The dying Everglades hasn't had a livelier or more compelling witness since Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. The swamp will sit cover to cover with her classic, The Everglades, River of Grass, on history's bookshelf. There could be no higher praise. Mike, we're so happy to have you this morning.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's always great to be in Orlando. You know, I get extra babysitting work here. So yeah, I thought I'm going to change up. I kind of have a usual shtick, and I'll give a little bit of it, but I'm also going to try to give a little bit of Everglades Restoration 101, since I know later we're going to be talking a little bit about the U.S. sugar deal. And I find that at these things, I always talk about restoring the Everglades, and nobody knows it. It's such a gigantic, billions of dollars being thrown around, and nobody knows exactly what that means. So I'm going to try to give the sort of Everglades for dummies, as well as, you know, the kind of usual Florida yarns that I try to throw out. But I thought I'd start with one of my favorite characters in the Everglades, and one of my favorite descriptions of the Everglades. It actually comes from the first U.S. government report on the swamp. It was written in 1848 by a St. Augustine resident named Buckingham Smith. Now somebody actually ought to write a book about this guy. He was really extraordinary. He was a lawyer, a politician, a diplomat, citrus grower, a slaveholder, but also a kind of abolitionist. He was a great philanthropist. While he was a diplomat in Madrid, he came across some Florida archives and essentially became the father of Florida history. Pretty amazing guy. He was not an engineer or a scientist, and like just about every other white guy of his era, he had never visited the Everglades before the Polk administration assigned him to investigate this strange swamp. There had been these reports of giant spiders and giant monkeys and mountains and possibly emerald deposits. But he went and he described this place with a lyricism that you don't find in a lot of Treasury Department documents. So I thought I'd read just a little bit of it. He goes, "Imagine a vast lake of fresh water, extending in every direction, from shore to shore, beyond the reach of human vision, unruffled by a ripple on its surface, studded with thousands of islands of various sizes. Lilies and other aquatic flowers of every variety and hue are seen on every side, in pleasant contrast to the sawgrass, and as you draw near an island, the beauty of the scene is increased by the rich foliage and blooming flowers of the wild myrtle and the honeysuckle. The profound and wild solitude of the place, the solemn silence that pervades it, add to awakened and excited curiosity feelings, bordering on awe." And this guy was clearly blown away, right? I mean, I love that, the profound and wild solitude of the place. I think that really captures the Everglades. But I should say that was not the first thing that Buckingham Smith noticed about this awesome wild landscape. The first and most abiding impression is the utter worthlessness to civilized man of the entire region. He concluded that the Everglades was suitable only for the haunt of noxious vermin or the resort of pestilential reptiles. And of course, the main recommendation of his report was that this strange Everglades should be eliminated as soon as possible. He dreamed of getting rid of all that unruffled water, of converting this wasteland that he said was as useless as the deserts of Africa into something useful and productive for mankind. Right? This was the age of manifest destiny, when Americans were destined to overspread the continent and conquer the wilderness. You know, exploiting nature, it wasn't just our right? It was our biblical duty. We all know God told us to be fruitful and multiply. Does anybody remember the rest of the instructions? Right? "And God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." Right? That's got to include the noxious vermin or at least the mosquitoes down there in in Cape Sable. Today we obviously feel a little bit differently about nature, and particularly about the Everglades. I set the beginning of the swamp in Washington D.C. Right, the other swamp. It starts on it takes place on December 11th, 2000. The opening scene. That was the day that President Clinton signed what was then, in the good old days, an $8 billion Everglades Restoration plan into law. It was going to be the largest environmental restoration project in the history of the planet. And standing right there at Clinton's side was, one of his great political supporters, a guy named Jeb Bush. It was a kind of weird day because December 11th, 2000, they were actually arguing a case down the street at the Supreme Court. You guys might have heard it was actually a Florida case. Maybe it was Bush v. Gore. Might ring a bell, right? So there you had Florida's political swamp essentially tearing the country apart along partisan lines. But here, Florida's actual swamp was bringing Republicans and Democrats together in the very building that they were all fighting over. Really, the Everglades had become motherhood and apple pie. Everybody agreed that it was a national treasure. So the swamp is the story of the Everglades. It's kind of how this pestilential hellhole became a national treasure. But it's really the story of man and nature in central and southern Florida. It's the story of the transformation of America's last frontier. It's kind of hard to fathom today now that this region has 7 million residents, 60 million annual tourists. Seems like 100 million golf courses and strip malls and Taco Bells and Jiffy Lubes and Comfort Inns, and you name it. But the 1880 census of Dade County, which, let's see, this is, back then Dade County stretched pretty much this whole thing, all the way to right about there. Just about everything south of Lake Okeechobee was Dade County. Actually, anybody want to guess the South Florida's population, 1880? 1,500, I heard. I hear 20,000. Yeah, it was 257. Right, you could have fit them in this room. Right, there were already 1.2 million people in New York City. 1887, which, I mean, really, it was not that long ago. I think John McCain was 12. I think no, but a woman named Isa Hardy. She wrote a book. It was called Sketches of South Florida Life, and she came down to a town that she called the extreme South Florida. And she wrote this. It was really over the top. She said, "How still it is here! How far, far out of the world it seems." That town was Orlando, right? Extreme South Florida. So the story of the Everglades is, I wouldn't have taken 2 years off my job to write this if I didn't think this was really a great story, a really fun story, because it's a frontier story, and my publicist would probably shoot me if I didn't put in a few plugs, but this is really a yarn. It's about the Seminole Wars. Right, America's costliest and bloodiest Indian wars. These were really America's first Vietnam, right? A quagmire in an unfamiliar swamp against this underestimated enemy that often retreated but never quit. Or the 1928 hurricane, which was really America's first Katrina, right? A lake blasts through a flimsy dike and kills 2,500 people, most of them were poor blacks who had no way of getting out of the floodplain. I don't know if you read Their Eyes Are Watching God, but that's a story essentially about the Everglades. I even tell in here the story of the 2000 election. I interviewed Vice President Gore, and he told me that he thinks he might have lost because of the Everglades. But if you want to know why, it's only $15. I mean, it's like that. But really. The story of the Everglades, it's full of great characters. It's got these heroes and scoundrels and amazing visionaries who are a little bit of both. But my favorite character it's really the Everglades itself. It's what, it's how many of you have been there? Have been to the Everglades? All right. Well, then I'm not going to spend too much time trying to convince you that it's a special place. But it's really it's a freak of nature. It's somehow alluring and forbidding at the same time. It's not quite land, not quite water. It's a soggy confusion of the two. And it doesn't have the majestic canyons or rugged cliffs or rolling hills that we think about when we think of these great and spectacular national parks. It doesn't have glaciers or geysers or craters. It's less ooh and ah than I'll read you. This is my description. You read a lot of flowery descriptions of the Everglades. I think my mom complained that I made it sound like not that great a place to visit. But this is my first description in the book. I say, it was a vast sheet of shallow water spread across a seemingly infinite prairie of serrated sawgrass, a liquid expanse of muted greens and browns extending to the horizon. It had the panoramic sweep of a desert, except flooded, or a tundra, except melted, or a wheat field, except wild. It was studded with green teardrop-shaped islands of tangled trees and scraggly shrubs, and specked with white spider lilies and violet-blue pickerel weeds. But mostly it looked like the world's largest and grassiest puddle, or the flattest and wettest meadow, or the widest and slowest moving stream. It had the squish and the scruff of an untended yard after a downpour, except that this yard was larger than Connecticut. That was the heart of the Everglades, right? This muddy, mushy, inhospitable marsh, just this gigantic sheet of water flowing through razor-edge sawgrass from right there, right around Lake Okeechobee, and it just kind of swept down to the 10,000 islands in Florida Bay. Really just too wet to farm, too dry to sail, relentlessly flat, teeming with rats and roaches and snakes and scorpions, and of course the thick clouds of bloodthirsty mosquitoes that flew up your nostrils and down your throat and into your ears. It was a tough slog, right? Breathing its heavy air, it felt like sucking on cotton. Wading through its hip-deep muck felt like marching in quicksand. And of course, penetrating those dense thickets of sawgrass felt like bathing in broken glass. One of those early explorers who came through the Everglades in the late 19th century. It's pretty amazing that there were still explorers in the late 19th century. He said, "My advice is to urge every discontented man to take a trip through the Everglades. If it doesn't kill him, it will certainly cure him." But that's, that area in here, that's the river of grass that Marjorie wrote so much about. But the Everglades was more than a river of grass, and it had more than swarming bugs and slithering reptiles. Now, the Sawgrass Everglades was part of an interconnected ecosystem that blanketed just about all of southern Florida, right? From its headwaters, right around Disney World, down to the coral reefs off the Keys. And we're talking about an area twice the size of New Jersey. Lakes and lagoons, creeks and ponds, pine flatwoods and hardwood hammocks. Of course, it had carnivorous plants, amphibious birds, oysters that grew on trees, cacti that grew in water, had Everglades minks and Everglades snail kites and Cape sable sparrows that you couldn't find anywhere else on Earth. Panthers and otters and the gators that you see on all the postcards, royal palms and wild orchids, and of course the millions of graceful wading birds that seemed to darken the sky. It was an incredibly productive ecosystem. I like telling the story about a guy named Mike Russo. He was a grad student in archaeology. He's at the Park Service now, but when he was doing his dissertation, they actually sent him out to the 10,000 islands, to an island called Hors Island. Now it's part of Key Marco, the developers. Hors Island was not so good for business, but they told he was going to go dig up a Calusa site there. Now, you guys probably know the Calusa were here around the time of Spanish contact, about 500 years ago. So Mike went out and started digging up the site, expecting to find the pottery from 500 years ago. And he said, this does not feel like a Calusa site, and this feels more like an archaic site. And of course, that didn't make any sense because archaic man in North America was considered a nomadic species, and this was clearly a permanent settlement. His professor said, Mike, you've obviously made a very serious mistake. Maybe you weren't paying attention in Archaeology 101. But he said, this feels older than that. It feels a few thousand years old. So he went and carbon dated it, and sure enough, it was 5,000 years old from around the time the Everglades was forming. It's pretty much the first permanent settlement that's ever been discovered in North America. And then when you think about it, I don't know, have any of you been to the 10,000 Islands? Now it's a great place. But this is a place where a modern entomologist once caught 300,000 mosquitoes in one trap in one night, right? So you think about these aboriginals who had the run of the entire continent, right? They could have gone to Aspen, they could have gone to Malibu. Why would they go to this bug fest, at the fringes of the Everglades? And anybody want to guess? The food. Yeah, I mean, it was an all-you-can-eat seafood buffet. I mean, you can go fishing in the 10,000 Islands today, and it's pretty good. But back then, it was better than agriculture. You just put your net in the water, and you had enough. Those nearshore estuaries, you had enough fish to feed your family, not just in the snowbird season, but all year long. It was just an unbelievably productive place. So you can probably see what I'm driving at here. I mean, the story of the Everglades is really about us. It's about how we've destroyed this unique and incredibly productive place, and now how we're trying to resuscitate it. It's about hubris and good intentions and unintended consequences. In just about every chapter of the book, you'll find somebody proclaiming something with absolute certainty that turns out to be absolutely wrong. I mean, my pal Buckingham Smith, he declared that $500,000 would beyond question be more than enough to drain the entire Everglades. It would turn southern Florida into, he thought there might be some timber there, and also would become a hub for the making of salt by solar evaporation, which is not exactly what it became. But I thought I'd maybe talk a little bit about how the Everglades became what it's become. And it really starts with Buckingham Smith. And here I'm going to go a little bit off message and try to use this a little bit. But Buckingham Smith had a pretty simple idea for how you can turn this South Florida area, Central and South Florida area, which was really, the weather's great, the soil's fantastic. Only problem was there's just all this water on the land. So he had a pretty simple idea of what you do. You pretty much just drain the Kissimmee River, which starts up here, and sorry, this pointer isn't working very well. But you drain that into Lake Okeechobee, so that'll drain all this area. But then the problem is Lake Okeechobee is going to get real high, and of course it's Lake Okeechobee that creates the Everglades. Lake Okeechobee is sort of spilling over its lower lip into the Everglades. Well, if you didn't have all that water in Lake Okeechobee, you wouldn't have an Everglades, and that's the whole idea. So Buckingham Smith's idea was that you dig a few canals, one out to this side, and then one out to this side, out to the Caloosahatchee, and out to the St. Lucie, and Lake Okeechobee would kind of drain itself. And of course, if that didn't quite do the whole job, you'd dig a few more canals from Lake Okeechobee out to this southeast coast here, to the Miami River, to the New River in Fort Lauderdale. And voila, the Everglades would pretty much drain itself. Now, fortunately, nobody got around to really trying it for the next 40 years or so, mainly because the guy who was the big political player at the time was a guy named David Yulee. And he was really gung-ho about draining the Everglades until he realized that there was only so much money, only so much land. You could give it to these drainage guys, or you could give it to the guys who were building railroads. And not only was David Yulee kind of the founder of Florida statehood and the first U.S. senator from Florida, he also owned a railroad. So he decided it would be a better idea to give the land and encourage railroad building rather than drainage. So because this guy was an unbelievably greedy hypocrite, the Everglades was saved for another 40 years. Like I said, there are unintended consequences. Then came Hamilton Diston, and he was a Yankee, like a lot of us. And his dad had been a very successful industrialist, and he kind of wanted to make his own name. And he liked fishing. He liked bass fishing. He came down to Florida. He said, is fantastic. I'm going to drain this place. That's how I'm going to make my name. And he was going to basically do the Buckingham Smith plan. Started up in the Kissimmee River. He actually created the town of Kissimmee. A lot of distant towns around here. St. Cloud is a distant town. He started digging a few canals, and sure enough, the waters went down. It was doing really great, but he even started building one of the canals here. He got about 6 miles down, I think, and before he ran out of money. One of the problems, sort of problem number one is dredging was a lot harder than people thought. And problem number two was that dredging seemed to work really great in the dry season, and particularly in dry years. It was like, wow, we drained this land, and sure enough, now it's all dry. And, and then it would start raining again, and suddenly these little canals didn't seem to work as well. So he ran out of cash. But then 1904, a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte Broward started running for governor. Now, he was another fantastic character. He was a real Horatio Alger story. Grew up in Orphan, started splitting rails like Abe Lincoln. He started working as a deckhand on one of those St. Johns River steamboats. Eventually worked himself up to be a captain of a steamboat. Got himself elected sheriff of Jacksonville. He was known as this real stickler for the law. My favorite Broward story is that they had the heavyweight championship of the world. They had the fight in Jacksonville one year, and when the fight was over, Broward jumped into the ring and charged both boxers with assault. But then he became, this Mr. Lawman. He became a real legend as an outlaw. He started smuggling guns and explosives to the Cuban rebels before the Spanish-American War, and that pretty much made his name. It got him elected governor of Florida in 1905. It was interesting because he was pretty much he was friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and he was like Teddy Roosevelt. He was a real progressive. He stood for Florida's first child labor laws, and like Teddy Roosevelt, he was a real conservationist. Around this time, there was the first big conservation movement in Florida was to save the wading birds of the Everglades that were being shot to death for ladies' hats. People liked the feathers. Those feathers really did become more valuable than gold. And Broward supported those original Audubon societies that were formed to protect those birds, and were very successful. He also, in his inaugural address, he said that his top priority as governor would be saving the Everglades. But of course, he didn't mean saving it from drainage and development. He wanted to save it from oblivion, because back then wetlands were still wastelands, and conservation meant the opposite of waste. Right? The wise use of our natural resources. Roosevelt used to say that conservation means development as much as it means protection, which I think, my mother-in-law is always quoting that, Carmen is. But no, it's not an accident that when you hear the phrase drain the swamp, right? It means solve a festering problem, right? And Broward figured, he used to always say, water will run downhill. Figure you just dig those few canals through the Everglades, and it would just drain itself and create an empire of the Everglades, just a lush farming region that would be America's winter garden, as well as a tourist region, a development region. And he was, this was a progressive. He was an unbelievably hands-on guy. Actually, I remember going through one of his letters. He was criticizing one of his contractors working on the drainage project. He said that didn't understand why he was widening one of the bulkheads on one of the dredges by 1/16 of an inch. Right? I'm not sure if Charlie Crist gets this involved in the details. But he was a good guy. I mean, Florida's leading conservationists of the time, a guy named John Gifford, he dedicated a book about the Everglades to the governor. He called the drainage project the greatest conservation work in the history of the United States. So, again, you don't know what you don't know. Incidentally, Gifford, he had a pen pal in Australia who sent him a few seeds of a swamp tree. And Gifford thought he wouldn't just write about conservation, he would help a little bit to drain the swamp. He planted a few of those seeds right around here. And it really was a terrific swamp tree. It spread right through the swamp like wildfire. You guys may have heard of Melaleuca. There are now 1 million acres of it in the Everglades, and of course we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to get rid of it. It's an invasive species. You know, the same kind of problems with Broward's canals, right? In the dry season, they carried all that desperately needed water right out of the Everglades, right, you know, into those nearshore estuaries. You had harsh droughts, spectacular fires, so bad that the kids going to school in Miami had to wear a handkerchief over their face so that the smoke wouldn't get in their eyes because the Everglades was on fire 50 miles away. You had saltwater intrusion of the drinking wells that were right around here, another problem that might sound a little bit familiar today. And of course, that rich black soil that had attracted the settlers to the Everglades in the first place started to dry up and blow away. But then once again, the wet season would come along, and these canals that were so fantastic at sucking the place dry during the dry season were suddenly completely inadequate. And that's when you started to hear the first jokes about Florida swampland, right? You know, buying land by the gallon, when Florida really became a real estate punchline. And then in 1928, that was no longer so funny when Lake Okeechobee, was hit by a hurricane, Category 4, blasted it right through its flimsy little dike, and the second worst natural disaster in American history. So, all right, enter my friends from the Army Corps of Engineers, the shock troops in America's war against nature. So the first thing they did was they built this, this flimsy dike wasn't going to do it. So they built a massive dike around Lake Okeechobee, the Hoover Dike, right? This was, people don't think of Hoover as a big government guy, but that's when, the Army Corps of Engineers was just getting, sort of the New Deal before it was the New Deal. And then after that was done, after World War II, they came up with the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Project. Well, it's for flood control and other purposes. And it was a massive plan to solve all the problems of the Everglades at once. Floods and fires, saltwater intrusion and soil subsidence, over-drainage and under-drainage. The Corps called the plan Conservation in Action because the basic idea was we're going to create this, we're going to rope that off, and that's going to be the Everglades agricultural area. We're going to conserve that for agriculture. And that, of course, you see is that nice little pink there of sugar fields. Then we're going to build a levee down here to keep the Everglades over here, and then we can develop all this. And then we're just going to have 2,000 miles of levees and canals to essentially get rid of every drop of water that falls in central and southern Florida and whisk it out to sea. You had and then, of course, because it turns out that there isn't that much downhill, water may run downhill, but there isn't that much downhill in South Florida. They also had pumps so powerful that the engines had to be cannibalized from nuclear submarines to really make that water go. And you gotta give the Corps their due. I mean, they came up with this plan. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, she's the author that made the Everglades famous. She called it the first scientific, well thought out plan the Everglades has ever known. She said it would keep the waters of the Everglades in balance, just as nature had once maintained it. Because essentially, these were going to be water conservation areas. In the wet season, you'd dump a lot of extra water there and on the lake. And then in the dry season, you could conserve that water so that these people could stick their straws into it. It's going to be fantastic. And you got to give them their due. Because the Corps made South Florida safe for one of the most spectacular development booms in human history, and really started once this project got going and really continued all just about up until the day that Christina and I bought our house in Miami Beach. But really, I mean, people talk about air conditioning or bug spray or social security, but it's water control that made the modern megalopolis possible. That's how you could have Disney World at the headwaters of the Everglades. That's how you can have the Palmetto and Sawgrass Expressway, or the Palmettos and Sawgrass used to be. And that's how you can have this army of red roof houses that's marched into the eastern Everglades, West Kendall, Westwood Lakes. Just about everything west of I-95 is former Everglades. And now, of course, you've got Naples and Fort Myers marching east into the western Everglades. Today, half the Everglades is gone. It's been drained and paved for agriculture and development. And the other half is really an ecological mess. Sometimes it's too dry, sometimes it's too wet, sometimes it's both at the same time. It's always polluted by nutrients from sugar fields and suburbs. It's been dammed and diverted by levees, highways, and canals. You know, Lake Okeechobee's in meltdown. You've got the Kissimmee River has been turned, was this magnificent serpentine river. It kind of squiggled through its floodplain like a drunken unicyclist. And now, of course, it's turned into, they didn't even call it a river anymore, C-38 Canal. It was just basically a sewage pipe for you guys in Orlando and a sort of drainage project for these cattle pastures around it. And then the biggest, most noticeable problem is that whenever Lake Okeechobee gets high, of course, you don't want to, you don't want to have 1928 happen again. You don't want another to blast through the dike. So what do? They blast billions of gallons east and west into those estuaries, and those were the most biodiverse estuaries in North America. But really, their delicate balance of fresh and salt water have been destroyed. You see dolphins going belly up, fish with their guts hanging out around Sanibel and Stewart. Got red tide so bad that you can barely breathe at the beach. And meanwhile, Everglades National Park down here, which was, they're supposed to put a fence around that. It wasn't supposed to be affected by all this development, but it's really America's most endangered park. You got 69 endangered species in the ecosystem, including Florida panthers, Everglades snail kites, and that Cape Sable sparrow that you won't find anywhere else. Invasive species, not just Melaleuca, but Lygodium, evil weevils, and of course those pythons. Have you guys seen the YouTube of the python v gator? It's a beautiful metaphor for what's happening with the natives and invasives tearing each other apart. And if you want a metaphor, right? You've got the South Florida, as South Florida keeps extending to the edge of the Everglades. Right there, you've got the Florida Panthers ice hockey arena, right? So close that an errant slap shot could just about land in the swamp. Just a perfect symbol of the runaway sprawl that's devastated the actual Florida panther. So then in the 60s, America started to think a little bit differently about nature. There was kind of this national embrace of this notion that we should stop fouling our own nests, that rivers like that one in Cleveland probably aren't supposed to catch fire. The bald eagle probably not supposed to go extinct. It is the symbol of the country. That wouldn't be good. But really, people began to understand that protecting our environment, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the landscapes we like, the fisheries that feed us, it's good for people as well as the bugs and bunnies. And in Florida, people began to understand, you didn't have to be a tree hugger to realize that the health of this entire region really depends on the health of the Everglades ecosystem. Not just because of the millions of bird watchers and fishermen and beachgoers and scuba divers who visit the ecosystem every year. But you've got the aquifers that store most of southern Florida's drinking water, sit right underneath the Everglades. And you've got them ravaged by runaway sprawl. And then, even more to the point, there's a reason I put the politics of paradise in the subtitle of the book. I mean, you start to see what that same sprawl that's damaging the Everglades and the ecosystem, you see what it's doing to the quality of life here, the unbearable traffic, the schools so crowded that in Broward County, the kids start lining up for lunch at 9:50 in the morning, and just that vanishing sense of place that, people feel like they moved to paradise, and, now it feels like the Jersey Turnpike with better weather, right? This isn't what they bargained for. So sort of skipping ahead a little bit, that's what led to this great comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. The Army Corps is going to, now I think we're up to $12 billion, God knows what they're going to end up spending, but basically to try to fix man's mistakes in the Everglades, which of course is another reason to care about this place. We're all going to be paying for it. The basic idea is to get the water right? The quality, quantity, the timing, and distribution. You're essentially going to try to store water that was once held naturally in the Everglades, in these wetlands, and instead of blasting it out to tide here and here, we're going to store it in enough reservoirs to cover the island of Manhattan, and then these 300 underground storage wells that basically you take the water and pump it down into the aquifer, hold it there until when you need it. And so the idea is that we'll store all that water, and kind of redistribute it to farms, cities, and the Everglades in the right amounts, the right time of year. It's going to be a win-win-win for everybody. Well, that was the idea. You'd have kind of seepage barriers here, curtain walls. You'd have a lake belt here with these gigantic lake, those quarry pits where they dig out all those rocks that end up becoming highways and driveways that sprawl into the Everglades. But then we're going to use those pits instead of turning them into lakefront properties. We're going to try to use them to store a little bit of water for Everglades National Park, maybe in 2035 if we're lucky. But the idea is we'll try to mimic the natural water depths by squirting water in the right amounts wherever we can store it, where we need it. The problem was the scientists at Everglades National Park. They didn't really think this was restoration at all. They saw a lot of swift and sure benefits for sugar farmers and the water utilities and rock miners, but the benefits for the Everglades were really highly uncertain and delayed for decades. It's not a core of biologists, and the basic problem that people complained about was that it didn't really get out of Mother Nature's way and just let the Everglades flow again. Flow was not one of those things that they thought made a real Everglades, but the scientists have really found more and more that flow is at the heart of what made the Everglades the Everglades. Now the scientists really were saying, why don't you just store the water at the top, let it move through the middle, get rid of these canals and raise these roads that are in the way, and let it flow down to the bottom again. But meanwhile, the plan is legally required to provide enough drinking water to double Central and South Florida's population, but there's no provisions for smart growth or water conservation. It's essentially asking the Army Corps, which, it's not exactly Picasso, but you're asking them to paint a restoration masterpiece. And meanwhile, the canvas is shrinking every day. At the time I wrote the book, I got a hold of one Army Corps memo that said the project was already way over budget and behind schedule, and it's not restoration at all. There was a new report just came out a couple weeks ago that basically said we're 8 years in, there's 68 projects. Why are none of them done? Why is nothing happening? Why is the Everglades getting worse every day? Now this is all a really big deal, not only for those of us who think the Everglades is cool, just as a nice place to visit, but South Florida and Central Florida, this is really where we're going to find out whether man can live in harmony with nature. This restoration plan, it's already a model for projects to revive the Chesapeake Bay, the Great Lakes, Louisiana's coastal wetlands that I've been obsessed with since Hurricane Katrina. Even I interviewed the guy who's in charge of restoring the Garden of Eden marshes that Saddam Hussein destroyed in southern Iraq, and he says that the Everglades is his model. So you could see how a successful project could really usher in a new era of sustainable development and ecosystem restoration. And you could show the world how to avoid these water wars that are otherwise you're going to hear a lot about in the 21st century, because water is going to be as precious as oil. And if, Palm Beach County and Broward County can't figure out how to share their water and maybe leave a little bit left over for the sawgrass and the gators, it's kind of hard to imagine how Israel and Syria are going to do it. Here you have the Everglades, right? It's the perfect place to practice, right? You got 3 million acres already in the public domain, so you got plenty of land. You've got, there's so much science. This is the world's most studied wetland, and God knows there's plenty of money in Florida, and this is a place that gets 60 annual inches of rain. So there's plenty of water. My God, think what they do for that in Iraq. And then finally, this is the world's most beloved wetland. So you have this incredible political commitment from right-wingers and left-wingers and buffalo wingers. Everybody wants to save the Everglades, right? So you really have to ask if we can't save this place, what can we save? But all is not lost. So let me I'm going to tell a little story. This is my first visit to the Kissimmee River. Remember, that was the kind of squiggly river down here that the Army Corps turned into a ditch. And I went to visit with a guy named Lou Toth. He was a guy who, 20 years ago, came up with this restoration plan he was one of the real geniuses behind the restoration plan for the Kissimmee. And the Army Corps was their first restoration project ever. And they were kind of dragged kicking and screaming into doing it, but they finally agreed that it was going to cost $800 million to restore just a third of what they destroyed for $50 million. But they finally reluctantly agreed, yeah, this is a project we can do. We will engineer you a new river. And and Lou and the other scientists kind of said, like, you guys, you're wonderful. You've done such a terrific job engineering the ditch. Why don't you just un-engineer that, and we'll let the river figure itself out. But again, kicking and screaming, the Corps did it, and they're coming along. I went to visit with Lou, and we went into this broadleaf marsh off the side of the river. Have any of you been in a broadleaf marsh? I mean, you want to talk about not the Grand Canyon. I mean, it's some scraggly vegetation. The water's up to my knees. But Lou's very excited. He cuts the engine on his airboat, makes this grand gesture, and he says, "A year ago, as far as the eye can see, this was all a bone-dry cattle pasture." So I was like, "Wow, that's really cool." I mean, because it's just been a year and it's already this scraggly little marsh. I mean, what's it going to look like in 10 years? And Lou looks at me like I'm a moron, because I was. It's like this. We're done. You get out of Mother Nature's way, and she comes back. Now, look, we're never going to make the Everglades exactly like it was. Bob Graham likes to say it would be restoring the omelet you ate for breakfast to its egg. But look, Lou Toth is one of those scientists who really doesn't think that the Everglades Restoration Plan, at least a few years ago, had learned very much from the Kissimmee restoration. He said it was too much of a Rube Goldberg engineering project, too much of a water supply project, doesn't kind of remove the barriers to flow and get out of the way. Well, now here comes Charlie Crist, and he's got a new idea, and we're talking about that area up in there that used to be the northern Everglades that are now 450,000 acres of sugar fields. And he essentially, the sort of long story short, and I think maybe Ernie will give some of the longer story later, but he's going to buy out U.S. Sugar. And the idea, the current plan, there's been so much criticism of this. The first criticism is $1.75 billion? Are you crazy? Well, right now we're spending not just the $12 billion on Everglades restoration, but if you include all the different restoration projects that are going on in this ecosystem, you're talking about $30 billion that are being spent. There are plans to spend $2 billion just on those aquifer storage and recovery wells that nobody really thinks are going to work at that level anymore. If you can actually get real restoration for $1.75 billion, I mean, you have got an incredible bargain. Then the complaint number two is, well, yeah, but if you do it there, that land has subsided. You can't make that Everglades again, and that's actually true. But really, they're not talking about making it the Everglades again right now. What they're talking about is that this is the missing link in Everglades restoration. If you can store water at the top and then let it flow through the middle and down to the bottom, it's pretty simple. But that's pretty much what Everglades restoration, if the scientists could draw it up on paper without having to please everybody, that's what they would do. They haven't been able to do it because you have 450,000 acres of people, owned by some very powerful people here. I tell the story in the book about how Al Gore came down to Everglades National Park and said, and announced that they were going to use 100,000 acres of the sugar fields were going to become reservoirs for restoration. And that afternoon, President Clinton was in the Oval Office. He was actually breaking up with his girlfriend. But if you look at the Star report. They interviewed Monica Lewinsky, and he said, and then what happened? And she said, well, he took a phone call. And he said, a phone call? Well, from who? She said, I don't know, somebody from Florida, a guy named Fanjuli. And if you look in the footnotes, it says White House switchboard records show that President Clinton spoke for 22 minutes with Alfonso Fanjul, who is not only the largest sugar grower in Florida, but was also his campaign finance chairman. 22 minutes, that's pretty good to get the president on the phone while he's otherwise engaged. And And the sort of long story short is there were only 50,000 acres in the original Everglades Restoration Plan would be used for reservoirs. But now we got a chance to use another 150,000 acres and use them for treatment marshes. And so to clean that water, to store that water up at the top, clean it, and bring it back to the natural system. So instead of storing it on the side in these crazy lake belt quarries that nobody knows when they're even going to go to the federal government, or if they're going to go, or whether they're going to be able to hold water. Instead of storing it in these crazy underground wells, which nobody knows if they're going to contaminate the aquifers with cryptosporidium or fracture the aquifers, or whether you're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on the energy to bring the water up. Instead, you're just going to store water in the top, let it move through the middle, and go down to the bottom. It's pretty much what the guys who were thinking about Everglades restoration wanted to do from the beginning. And this is the kind of thing you're going to have to do, because look, you got 7 million people down here, and I don't care what the real estate market is like right now. There are more people are going to come because it beats the hell out of Cleveland and Buffalo in the winter. And for different reasons it beats the hell out of Havana and Port-au-Prince all year long. But there's still a lot you can do to fix what's left of the Everglades. People are always saying that the Everglades is fragile, right? And I suppose in a way it's about as fragile as ecosystems get, because it's so flat. So even just a few inches in the topography can just transform the biology. And of course, in its natural state, it was just pristine. People used to say it's cleaner than Evian. Well, yeah, it really was. The sugar guys used to say cleaner than rain is insane. It was just about cleaner than rain. So even tiny amounts of phosphorus can really mess up that system. But nature is not that fragile. And when you stop beating up on it, Marjorie used to say that the Everglades was like an old tire. It was tough, it's resilient. And when you stop hitting it over the head with a hammer, it'll come back. You can see that in the Kissimmee Valley. But before the war in Iraq, Colin Powell, he used to talk about the pottery barn rule for invading sovereign countries. Have you guys heard about this, right? You break it, you own it. Well, we broke the Everglades, and it's really going to be up to us to put it back together. And environmentalists like to say that the Everglades is a test. If we pass, we may get to keep the planet. And I think that's true. It's going to be a test of our scientific knowledge. It's going to be a test of our engineering ability. It's going to be a test of our political will. It's really going to be a test of the very concept of sustainable development. But most of all, I think it's going to be a moral test. It's going to be a test of our willingness to restrain ourselves and figure out how to share the Earth's resources with all those other living things that moveth upon it, and finally figure out a way to live in harmony with nature. And if we can pass that test, we may deserve to keep the planet.